Hi guys. Guess what? This is our last lesson before Christmas. Can you believe it? That's crazy. It feels like, I don't know. But that's why I'm all decked out in Christmas gear. I love this time of year. I kind of go all out for it. I really like embarrassing my children and wearing big ugly sweaters. See, I got Santa riding on his sleigh with sunglasses on. Not because I'm all about like Santa and stuff, but I like to see the joy that it brings to people and hope. Like, and isn't that what Christmas is about? We got a Savior who was willing to die on the cross for us. He was born. That's a great thing to celebrate. I'm so excited. I hope you guys are excited for Christmas. I know for some of you it's going to look a lot different than it has in the past, but hopefully you can still find joy in it and some family time. So to get on with our story. So God still has this covenant with the people of Israel. They were meant to be the distinguished and blessed people. That, however, meant that they also had to be obedient, which, in case you haven't been paying attention, they're not so good at that. They kind of grumbled and they kind of complained and they kind of wanted everything they didn't have. They wanted to go back to Egypt when they were rescued. They wanted more than manna, and they broke all the rules when Moses was gone for like a month and decided that they could just do whatever they want because they thought he was never coming back after a month. Easy for us to say. We're not living it. They were. But therefore, I can mock them a little bit. Probably shouldn't. Anyway. So now we're in the time of judges. Remember, God had appointed judges to rule the people of Israel instead of kings. But they weren't happy with that because all of their pagan neighbors, they all got to have kings. They wanted a king. So we'll get to that. I'm jumping ahead. Anyway, so we're at the time of Judges, and they were supposed to be obedient, and they were quite the opposite. They had abandoned God at everything he had said and everything he had done, and few people even remember God's promises, and even fewer even obeyed them. But throughout the Bible, there's always those few dedicated and amazing people. Like last week, remember we talked about Hannah, and she was heartbroken over not being able to have children, and she was so devoted to praying to God and did so with such passion that Eli the priest thought she was drunk. Now think about that. Being drunk means that you're not really talking straight and you sound kind of out of it, and you're not making a whole lot of sense. So that's how she sounded. But God heard her, and God still gave her a son named Samuel. So those times when you're thinking, I don't know how to pray, I just never do it well. That doesn't mean he doesn't hear you. That just means that you're passionate. So don't ever think that your prayers aren't good enough. Anyway, so Samuel ended up going to the tabernacle where he served under Eli, who taught him, and then eventually took Eli's place. Now, this is the point of the story where the people of Israel really wanted a king. All their pagan neighbors had a king, and they really wanted one too. So God was like, fine, here's Saul. So, Saul, which brings us to our lesson this week. So, he had it all. He had style, and he had class, and he had height, and he was very kingly and very impressive. He was just what the people wanted. Problem was that Saul was out for Saul and Saul alone. He cut corners on all of God's commandments, So God started to look for a new king. And our story begins in a little house in Bethlehem of the man named Jesse. Jesse had 7 sons, and they were paraded in front of Samuel, but none were chosen. The youngest son, David, was not invited and was found amongst the sheep. Different story. He was chosen to replace Saul. And he did what any new anointed king would do. He went back to his sheep. Just because you're chosen by God doesn't mean that you get to be king right away. But soon there was a big battle against the Philistine armies. And David's brothers were all up on the front line, and they were hungry. So David came and brought him a snack. So he brought him a snack and some supplies. But David saw something that nobody else saw. He saw an opportunity and a chance to show God's power. He faced that mighty giant. And he won based on his faith in God. Remember, all he had was a stone and a slingshot, and he knocked that giant out. Not because he was capable, but because he had enough faith to believe that God had his back. Saul was so impressed. He brought him into the king's court and assigned him a high rank over military operations. David became a part of the family, and Jonathan, Saul's brother, was his best friend. And Saul's sister soon became his wife. David's wife, that is. His fame and popularity started to make Saul really jealous. And he tried to kill David. So David fled for his life, but Saul chased after him ruthlessly. And he killed anything in his path. During the chase, David actually got to a point where he could have killed Saul. But he didn't, out of respect, because he was a man that God anointed as king. Now that's some faith. Saul was very grateful, and he changed his ways. Bro on. This is when David wrote a lot of his psalms. Now, David wrote most of the psalms, and psalms are like these beautiful poetries and songs that are dedicated to God. Some of them are a little bit like in anguish and like torment, but some of them are really praising and loving, and they're really great. But Saul was so obsessed that he didn't even notice that the Philistines were attacking, and he was not prepared for the battle, and him and his brothers ended up losing their lives. This really broke David up, mostly because his best friend died. And he was sad that everybody else died, but he was really upset that Jonathan died. But it would be 7 years before David got to rank and be king over Israel. But when he did, he conquered the city of Jerusalem and made it the capital, and brought back the Ark of the Covenant. Remember that? That had been wandering everywhere. And then he brought God back into Israel. And he was the VIP to everybody but his wife. David felt really at home and wanted God to be at home too. Now in 2 Samuel, it says, so there's another prophet named Nathan, and he was told by the Lord the following: Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord said. You are the one to build me a house to dwell in. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Whenever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of the rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people of Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following flocks to be a ruler over my people of Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off your enemies before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people of Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, and as they did in the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When the days are over, you will rest with your fathers. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build the house for my name, and I will establish a throne for his kingdom forever. So even though David really wants a house for God, God's like, that's not your job right now. Thanks, but I'm fine. I need you to be a leader to your people. Don't worry. I will make somebody, he will happen to be your offspring. So David was sitting pretty. He was high in the ranks and people loved him. But David was also human and very comfortable. And sometimes when you get a little comfortable, you kind of forget God's teachings and discipline. So, as he grew in popularity, he started to look at things that weren't his, namely a woman called Bathsheba, who was not his wife and also had a husband of her own. They became kind of friendly, and she became pregnant, though her husband was out fighting in the war. David then sent Bathsheba's husband to the front lines where he was killed. And then he married Bathsheba. Not a great thing for a great king to do. So, Nathan shows up, the prophet, and tells the story. It's a parable. And he says, he basically calls him out in this story. Well, guilty kings don't fare well with prophets. I mean, they literally know everything. So David saw what he had done, and he felt really bad, which is more than any other king had done. Now, remember all those other guys we talked about that kind of got selfish and decided to use the reign for their own sakes? David actually repented. But David and Bathsheba ended up losing their son, which is really sad and very heartbreaking for him. And also reminded him that wicked behaviors sometimes don't work out so well. But Bathsheba they ended up having another son named Solomon, along with 5 other sons. However, David wasn't a very good father, even though he was a really good king. And his son Absalom decided he wanted to be a king and tried to throw over his dad. So they went to war. This led to a big battle that even though David asked for the warriors to be gentle on his son, they weren't. They hung him from a tree. David was really heartbroken over the experience, as you can imagine. I mean, when you're like, oh, he did this because I wasn't a great dad, and now I just lost another son. It was heartbreaking. But David used this experience to change his ways. David saw his son Solomon's heart and knew the time had come where he had to pass the throne over to Solomon. Okay. Oh no, I lost my page. The time, in 1 Kings chapter 2, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, show yourself a man, observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways and keep his decrees and commandments, his laws and requirements as written by the law of Moses, so that you may go and prosper in all you do and wherever you go. And the Lord your God may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man. You will never... Now you yourself know. Oh, sorry, that was it. Yeah. Should have marked that better. I'm sorry. So he basically gave his final blessings, and it was all about how to rule, but how to rule through God and to make God first. That was really important to him. So, and Solomon did end up building a house for the Lord where the Ark of the Covenant could be. God was faithful in that. And, yeah. So what does that mean for us? Why is David even in the Bible? Well, you see, David was perfectly chosen by God. He was the odd man out, and he came up. And did he fail? Yeah, he failed big time. He committed big time sin. He stole somebody's wife and then had a baby with her, and then went and had him killed at war. None of that is good. But our God is a God of grace and mercy. And David felt really bad about it, and he repented, and he went back to God, and he showed people that his commandments are good. And he also raised up his own kids in the way of the Lord. So nothing you can do is too far from God's love. You are always welcome back in his arms. And you don't have to be perfect. So, that's the story of David. I would like to know any questions you have for me, about what you think of the story, how you think it went, because this is actually a really big story, and I had to cut it out. So if you have any other questions for me, I'd love to talk about it. I would like you, what do you think? Do you think that you would be able to forgive David for what he had done? Do you think David should have still been able to be king after that? And I want to know what you're doing for Christmas. So, I'm going to pray. Dear Father God, thank you. Thank you so much for these kids and your word and my ability to be able to share it with them. Even if I don't always do it well and I read kind of funny, I know that your message is true and clear no matter what. I pray you watch over them as they go throughout this break and let them know that they are loved. That we love them at church, we miss them, and we can't wait to see them again. I pray that you bless them with a wonderful Christmas season, Lord, and you just shine through even all the tinsel and holly jolliness, that we all remember that you are actually the joy behind the season. Pray all this in your name. So remember, we don't have a confirmation lesson next week. We will be back on the 6th. And when you guys get back, if you feel comfortable, there's also this thing called Breakfast Club with no breakfast right now because of COVID. But if you want to come on Sundays from 9 to 10, we'd love to have you. But if not, I totally understand as well. But we will see you later and have a Merry Christmas!